And we are live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bigfoot Odyssey. Spook Week is the fifth night in this installment. And man, we got a great show for you tonight. I'm your host, Carrie Arnold. With me, as always, producer and co-host, Daniela Aiello. How are you tonight, dear?
I'm good, thank you. Looking forward to tonight.
Yeah, I think everyone's kind of been looking forward to this, especially myself. You know, it's kind of, when we first brought him on, got a little starstruck. You know, this is the way it is. And I'm sure he's quite used to that. But our guest for this evening, it really needs a little introduction, but he is the professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. Excuse me. He is the author of Sasquatch Legend Meets Science and the Sasquatch Field Guide, Dr. Jeff Meldrum.
Hi.
Welcome, Doctor. Good to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. The pleasure is absolutely all ours. Before we get started, just want to remind everyone in the chat, we try to keep it family, so keep it clean for us. We do appreciate that. We got the best moderators on YouTube, and they will time you out. So we'll try to take questions for Dr. Meldrum the last 10 or 15 minutes of the show, so try to save those questions for then. Put them all in caps for us so we can pick them out, and we definitely appreciate that. All right, without any ado, let's get started. Dr. Meldrum, you know, I think everybody knows who you are at this point. If they've looked at the Sasquatch subject at all, they've seen your face somewhere. It's you've been around, you've done so much, and you're greatly respected, appreciated. I can't tell you how many times someone has sent some evidence in, and when we've shown it, and they say, you need to send that to Jeff Meldrum, you know, and I'm sure you get so many things. I can only imagine. So just give us a quick, what if your field guide, I know I've seen it on, there was a documentary done about your Legend Meets Science. We saw that. And then the field guide, I'm kind of more interested in the field guide and how researchers should be using this thing.
Well, you know, it came about, this company that published it, Paradise K, which is on the West Coast, approached me about writing a field guide for Sasquatch. And there had been a couple of attempts by other authors in the past with varying success. And, you know, you have to wonder, how do you write a field guide for something that is essentially unknown, at least nothing known for certain about it? But it occurred to me, I'm repeatedly asked questions like, well, how do you make a footprint cast? Or what should I do with this hair that I collected from the branch? And so on. And the notion of a how-to guide, you know, there is a real upsurgence of enthusiasm for what's been labeled as citizen science. The notion that, and I hope that doesn't strike anyone as condescending or you know, deflecting in any way. It's not intended to be. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that, you know, as a professional scientist, I can't be everywhere. And this subject especially doesn't lend itself to me going out and collecting evidence systematically, as, say, my herpetologist colleague down the hall from me. And so I'm very beholden to those people who are willing to share the evidence and information that they collect. And I want them to be successful, and I want them to document their evidence, to collect it and preserve it effectively and reliably, and be able to discriminate so that we don't have to winnow through so much chaff to get to those nuggets, those kernels of evidence, of reliable evidence. So that's how it grew out, or grew up and was gestated and given birth to, and it's been very well received. I mean, I get all kinds of positive feedback from people. It's an especially useful tool as well, since it's profusely illustrated for young investigators. So there's a whole generation of upcoming young Bigfoot enthusiasts who repeatedly let me know how much they rely on or enjoy their field guide and take it with them when they go on hikes out in the field. And that's great. That's the best compliment an educator can receive, is to have that kind of enthusiastic reaction.
We need them. We need the young people. We need more people paying attention to the subject. And that's really what we try to do here more than anything, is just push awareness, whether you believe or not. Just consider the possibility when you're out there in the woods. And that's all you can really ask of anyone. I don't think there's anything at this point, especially in the digital age, that we can put out there that's going to prove anything. And to me, the best evidence we have are the foot tracks. It's actual physical, tangible evidence. Video, the really good Patterson Gimlin stuff aside, the foot tracks are the same. And you've actually studied these for a long time. Is this what actually convinced you that there was these creatures out there?
Exactly. I mean, it's what drew me in as a professional. I'm not just. I've had a long-standing interest ever since I was a youngster, and that interest, has waxed and waned over the years as various interests and preoccupations come and go. But as a professional, my expertise is in the functional morphology of the adaptations to bipedalism exhibited in the early hominins and in humans, obviously today, and so the prospect of another bipedal primate out there is what was the ultimate hook, the attraction. When I had the opportunity to examine footprints in the field for the first time, I mean, it was an exceptional incident, and fortunately so, because I mean, it really set the hook deep. This was not just one spurious, possible ambiguous footprint. It was a long line of absolutely pristine, clear tracks, 15-inch tracks. And so, that was the moment when, when the hair stood up on the back of my neck, as I've described, and the realization set in that, my gosh, a real Sasquatch just walked by here last night. And, that was 7 casts in 1996, and now I have over 300 examples of footprint casts, not only from North America, but from other parts of the globe as well, relating to other relic hominoids. And they're fascinating. Here's an example of one from the Patterson Gimlin film site. This was one of the pair that were cast by Roger Patterson. And then here's another example, which is really fascinating and has kind of been at the center of much of my discussion about the modeling of the functional morphology of the Sasquatch footprint and the differentiation of it from the human adaptation. This was cast by Bob Titmus at the site shortly after the filming, about 10 days later. And it's remarkable in that it has this very distinctive pressure ridge that is indicative of the flat, flexible foot of the Sasquatch, with its mid-tarsal break, as it's referred to. Not break in the sense of damaging, but break in the sense of an axis of flexion.
Right.
And that we could talk all night about just that particular adaptation and the pivotal role that evidence has played in convincing me and convincing others of my colleagues who understand that anatomy, that there is really something to this. I mean, something is leaving tracks, and it's not easily explained away.
Yeah, and I've heard it before. There's an arch in it that can't be a Sasquatch print. The Bigfoot doesn't have an arch. And as important as anything is the substrate. Obviously, that was the perfect substrate to leave such pristine and perfect tracks like that. But there's the foot does all kind of things, and you would think an animal, especially of this size, having to carry around this much weight, would have to have a very versatile and flexible foot. And that, depending on the substrate, it's going to go all different directions.
Right. We've been able to reduce that flexibility because our adaptation really is one for the open terrain, and where we've emphasized endurance, running, and walking. And so a foot that's capable of some accommodation, but yet able to twist into a rather rigid configuration that allows it to act as an effective lever, thus elongating our lower extremity even a little bit more, and the ability to load the tissues like the Achilles tendon, which is like a big bungee cord. It's an excellent shock absorber that actually stores elastic energy and helps to return that back on the uptake. And so that, in contrast to like you said, described a big, heavy, massive animal that's negotiating often extremely steep and mountainous terrain and very rugged, irregular terrain, where the ability to use to retain longer toes than ours, just slightly longer, but still significantly longer as prehensile appendages there, and the longer heel that allows for greater leverage to negotiate that massive weight up the hillside. And the rest of the anatomy just all falls in line. The massive buttocks that's often described and visible on Patty. I mean, that's a hill climbing adaptation, if ever there was one. And so it just makes it's remarkably consistent. This isn't something that just dropped out of the ether. It is a biological species that is remarkably well adapted to the very habitat that it allegedly inhabits, and that's a satisfying aspect of it for me as a biologist.
Absolutely. And I've got one more thing before Daniela takes over. Aside from the tracks, to me, the eyewitness accounts, the anecdotal evidence, if you will, is our next best evidence. And I would put video and things like that, a close third. But you listen to some of these things and the apparent variation in the way these creatures look, the way they behave from one place to another, it's very broad and extreme. Now, I've heard you assert that this could possibly be an ancestor of Gigantopithecus. What is it that leads you to think that? Or is that still how you feel?
Well, I think that is a reasonable working hypothesis, a null hypothesis. And I've also proposed an alternate as well that I think is worthy of considering. It sort of depends on which pieces of evidence you weight disproportionately. So with Gigantopithecus, which had these massive thick jaws, just like we see on the Patterson-Gimlin film, this flat, deep face that's characteristic of these apes and early hominins that had this hypertrophy of the chewing apparatus. With Gigantopithecus, I mean, we know there was a giant ape that was alive up through the mid-Pleistocene in East Asia. So you've got a candidate that's the right size in the right place at the right time. But we don't know for sure if it stood upright. Okay, if it was bipedal, there's a good argument that could be made. Grover made an argument from one perspective, looking at the configuration of the angle of the jaw. You can make also a locomotor argument that if this creature, any large ape that has the shoulder apparatus of an arm-hanging, arm-swinging primate rather than a quadruped, when it comes to the ground, its shoulders just aren't really well suited to walk as a quadruped, and especially not if it weighs nearly 1,000 pounds. And so it would behoove it to walk on bipedally more than it would quadrupedally. So that argument could be made. But on the other hand, if you're of the mindset that, well, but bipedalism is this distinctive adaptation of the hominins, of the human ancestors and cousins, then what you have to look on the other side of the split from the last common ancestor shared with the great apes, with the African apes. And you can't go, in my opinion, you can't go too far down that lineage, because we don't see evidence, I don't see evidence anyway, of Sasquatch having the kinds of behaviors, and especially not the material culture, the archaeological remains that we associate with Homo. And so you have to look down at the base of that radiation of early bipeds. And where do you find that massive jaws and facial adaptation? In the robust Australopithecines. So we know that Paranthropus, an East African form, lived alongside the emergence of Homo right up through Homo erectus, or in Africa, Homo ergaster is referred to as, until maybe about 800,000 years ago. So, you know, wrong size, wrong time, wrong place, but it's not such a stretch anymore, because as we keep finding more discoveries, like the Hobbit, for example, a very Australopithecine or Habiline-like creature that survived in Southeast Asia until just a few tens of thousands of years ago. So why not a robust Australopithecine that could have spread across Asia and along the way attained gigantism, just as Gigantopithecus did, along with so many other mammals of the Pleistocene, especially as they adapted to northern climates during that colder period, where large body mass was an excellent adaptation to survive in that kind of climate and habitat. So I've got, you know, both of those are up there. I draw the line, though, at suggesting that this is some form of human that is just simply, you know, at one with nature and requires no material support, no accoutrements. I don't see the evidence of intelligence. I've not had the experiences that that some claim to have, as far as mind speak or other forms of parapsychological phenomenon. I'm open to that. I mean, certainly anything is is reasonably possible, but no one's been able to demonstrate or to bring me in on that kind of an experience.
Absolutely. It is. I think it's important to open yourself to the possibility of any report that comes in. And we talk about that here a lot. And you're right. What appears to be an immutable characteristic is that prognathic head that you hear that in almost every report. But to me, and what's been suggested is some hybridization. You know, I look at the feet. There's no divergent toe going on there, which is almost an ape-like feature. You know, and the apparent intelligence. So you're right. There's however you approach it, as I guess the way you're going to believe in this, until we get a type specimen, or many type specimens.
That's final arbitration, isn't it? Once it gets a little. I mean, I think it's counterproductive when people generate so much passion about a pet theory that is just that. It's a pet theory. And I think it's important to establish a context for our conversations about the potential existence of such a creature, as you're creating a rational argument for that possibility, or that even beyond that, for that probability. I mean, I think it's absolutely possible. Everything in science now screams that there could very well be relic hominoids out there of various stripes. Anyone who says they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, is just simply ignorant of the state of the science today. They can exist. Now, the question is it likely, is it probable that they exist under the circumstances and with a lack of conclusive evidence and, you know, under our very nose argument, you know, then you have to weigh what are the likelihoods. And so when you keep putting bits of evidence, footprints, hair, eyewitness accounts, photographic information, and so forth, you know, the scale starts to tip decidedly. Native American traditions, all these other things. I mean, it's an amazingly compelling package that you end up with when you consider all these different lines of evidence.
Well, but let's talk about hair samples.
Yeah.
Mine Chinsky got some in the 70s. What were the results of that? And what's the results of more recent hair samples if you're testing them?
Right. Well, yes, John Meinzinski, they had submitted some hair samples to the state veterinarian there, and he looked at them. He came back and he said, these look like primate hairs. You should have an anthropologist maybe look at them. And they did. They had an anthropologist look at them, and they also sent some samples off to the FBI. The FBI sent them back and said, well, these aren't human, so we don't have anything really to say about them. And so you had this hair that couldn't be attributed to any form of wildlife, that looked like a primate hair, but that the FBI said wasn't human. But then, unfortunately, his supervisor, there was a turnover in administrative positions, and the new fellow on the block did not want any appearance of chasing after wild fowl under his jurisdiction, and so he put the kibosh on it entirely. We've then later I interacted a lot with Dr. Henner Fehrenbach before he retired from the Oregon Primate Research Center, and he was a microscopist by training, but very intelligent man who was able to very readily to sort of teach himself general hair diagnosis, and of course had access to excellent microscopic equipment. So as he and I discussed, we were aware of various reports that had resulted from submitted samples, reports based just on the morphology of the hair, not DNA analysis, and invariably, because you must realize that hair is identified typically by comparing it to a known sample. And so, a good hair analyst will have an archive of samples of all sorts of wildlife hair and domestic hair and various samples of human hair and so forth. And you meticulously go through and compare. It's not a blind comparison. Quickly you understand the basic distinguishing characteristics of the major groups of mammals and humans, etc. But anyway, each of these would come back as indeterminate, and that was really the only reasonable conclusion they could draw. So we thought, well, what were the characteristics that brought them to that result? And so we went and backtracked and followed up on some of these previous reports, and sure enough, there was this litany of distinguishing characteristics that was remarkably consistent across all these independently collected and submitted samples. And so that, and applying that to other examples that would accumulate, and every time I would get a sample, that time I would pass it along to Henner, Dr. Fehrenbach. Eventually, he came up with his gold standard of what a Sasquatch hair would look like. And we've prior to his retirement, since, as I've kind of taken over the reins and I do a lot of that discrimination under the microscope now, we've got samples that fit the gold standard from Alaska to Texas, and they're remarkably consistent. It's really, really quite stunning. Now, unfortunately, one of those distinguishing characteristics seems to be a rather consistent absence of a cellular medulla, that central shaft of the hair that shows up as the dark band under a light microscope. And unfortunately, in hair that is shed, during the telogen phase, when it just slips out of the follicle, the root is essentially quiescent. There is no active cell division going on. And so the only DNA you're possibly going to find is in that follicle, in that active follicle, or if it's forcefully pulled out, you'll often get a little skin tag associated with it. But in the shaft itself, it's essentially keratin. It's an extracellular protein. There are no nuclei or mitochondria to containing DNA. So we've run into this sort of brick wall where either we don't get any DNA, or DNA is found which is very similar to or identified as human. And so the explanation is, the conclusion drawn is that it was contaminated by handling by the investigator, or two, it simply misidentified human hair. Well, there's a third possibility, and this is one that kept niggling back there, and I started asking other geneticists and so forth and about this, and because usually if a DNA analysis is conducted, they'll look at one mitochondrial locus, and they might not even look at the entire gene. They'll just look at maybe a few thousand base pairs, and if they can identify a few distinguishing markers, then they can quite readily peg it as this, that, or the other. But if we're talking about a creature that is a hominin, even more so than if it were even just not just, but an ape on that side of the divide, we're talking about something that's maybe less than 1%, less than, just a few tenths of a percent distinct from us. And so if you just go in there and look at one little spot, the chances of finding that, 0.1% difference is pretty slim. And so what's the answer going to be? If you kick that into GenBank and look for a match, it's going to match it up with human and kick it back and say it's human. I brought this up with one fellow, and he said, oh, you're absolutely right. One geneticist, he said, if I were doing this, I would do the entire mitochondrial genome and at least a half a dozen nuclear genes. Well, that's a much more ambitious project and a much more pricey project to undertake. So that isn't routinely done, and especially not by, the documentary production companies that sometimes foot the bill for these kinds of analyses if the lab's not in a position to do it gratis. And I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars potentially. So that's kind of where we're at. We're kind of with the hair. We're sort of stuck.
If a body was presented to you, or part of a body, would funding be found, do you think, within? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, if we could, through conventional means, or there would be philanthropic sources, private foundations, and donors who would come immediately to the base, to the plate, that is, to the plate to make that happen, certainly. But you've got to be able to demonstrate your case, because we've had so many out there crying wolf. I won't name any, just not to give them any acknowledgement or recognition, but there have been some ridiculous debacles here of late.
Right. Okay. So you've got to make good judgments then, I guess, on who's sending it in, and exactly.
Well, yeah. Well, of course. I mean, yeah. You can't. I mean, I've learned in this field that for whatever intentions, whether they be laudable or nefarious, you cannot, or simply naive, you cannot take people at their word. When Carrie mentioned anecdote being up there high, well, you got to be really careful, because unless there's some substantiation, I mean, it's not hard to concoct a story now. I mean, this topic is widely known. It's been dramatized on television. There's all sorts of artwork out there. I mean, to seed people's imaginations, people can spin all kinds of yarns, but the proof is in the pudding. You need to substantiate. You need to corroborate your claims, and those in the past that have cried wolf, when they've finally put up, I mean, it's been all too transparently, ridiculously hoaxed, and so you just can't. And then on the other hand, like I said, the footprints is a good model, because like you said, it's something that's substantial. I mean, we could argue whether it's physical or trace evidence and splitting hairs there, but nevertheless, something had to impress that footprint. And so you've got a record that you can preserve with a footprint cast and with photographs, and you can return to it again and again and again. You can show it to other people and so forth. They don't have to take your word for it. I mean, when I mean, just a case in point, I had a student who was interested in forensic anthropology and Bigfoot, and she wanted to see how she could kind of meld those two. And so she was interested in footprints. And I said, well, I've got a little project that I've been hoping to get some help with, and I wanted to look more closely into the alleged Yeti footprints. And so, because, you know, you can find books that have tabulated lists of all the different footprints that have been supposedly observed by various mountaineers and explorers and so forth. Well, but how much of that is actually documented? Well, we found quite a few. We scoured through the literature and publications and found all that we could find there. And then we found a number of additional examples, some that were online in obscure web pages or whatnot. And then even through personal correspondence with some of the heirs of some of these early explorers, like Frank Smith. His son was kind enough to share some proof sheets of all the photos that he took of his Yeti tracks, which weren't widely published in his books. And it became evident why they weren't, because they were bear tracks, as plain as day, as plain as the nose on your face. They were bear tracks, and that's what we discovered, is that a significant fraction were just unintelligible. They were just from melting and sublimation and distortion. You couldn't determine what they were if your life depended on it. But then of those that remained, the majority were bear tracks. And there were only a couple that, like the famous Shipton, which still has some big question marks after it, and the McNeely Cronin are by far some of the most interesting. And then we found some more photos from Hutchison that are remarkably similar to the McNeely Cronin. Anyway, the point is, my point is simply, if you just flipped open, somebody's essay about Yeti evidence, and here's a table of footprints, you'd have no way of knowing that there's really only 2 or 3 that really could possibly be a hominoid. The others are either bear or they're just absolutely unintelligible. And with Sasquatch footprints, when people bring evidence to me, they, unfortunately, I have to sift through a lot of things that are just, again, unintelligible. There was one just the other day. He was quite convinced that he had this alternating pattern. And I said, well, I looked at it. I said, these are just ruts, erosional ruts. They're just runoff artifacts. And he said, that's what my wife said. And I said, well, you should listen to your wife. She's dead on. And, I've had experienced hunters who, when they encounter bear tracks that have registered fore and hind paws overlapping for a stretch, they see an alternating pattern of what looks like a biped, and they ignore everything else. It's really straightforward to point out, here's the metatarsal pad. You can see that tapering here. You can see the parabolic disposition of the toes. There's even a few claw marks evident there, And so my point is, if I find that where there's documentation available and such a small fraction of reported footprints have any merit, you have to apply that same kind of scale, I'm afraid, to anecdotes of visual encounters. You have to weigh the experience and the powers of observation of the witness, the conditions, the duration, exactly, and all those different factors. There's no 2 experiences that are on par with one another. And even the most well-intentioned, even the most genuine witness could have just saw a black bear bolting through the woods. I mean, that happened to me one time. We were out on field operations, and we did bump into a black bear. And it went crashing through the brush. And I turned around just in time to get a flash of black fur as it went through a gap between shrubberies there. And, if I had really wanted to see a Sasquatch or really have an experience to share with my family when I got home, I could have described what I saw and just not mentioned the fact that it was a bear, and it would be a pretty impressive story, and but I would never do that.
No.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And feedback again. Is it just okay? It's done this before. It's crazy. And I'll tell you, the reason that I put a lot of the anecdotes up there high is just to kind of save myself a little bit is I don't know. Setting aside anyone that does anything noteworthy in the subject, you can there's a lot to dissect. You can look at the person.
Sure.
That's what we look at. That's what I look at, is the person, and anything that's true stands the test of time.
Exactly.
And looking at that person and that person's history. And I mean, because you got grandma that has no stake in this and, hits one with her car. Those are the types of, obviously you can't take everyone's word, and I get that. And then probably can't even take grandma's word because, hey, my eyes are getting bad and I'm 47. So, there are a lot of variables in there. Perception is reality. So if you see a black bear walking up through the woods and you got Bigfoot on the brain, I guess possibly you could see a Sasquatch. You just obviously alluded to that. So we're going to go ahead.
I'm just going to add that things have changed with time too. I mean, back when John Green was writing his books and tabulating all these different reports and so forth, and there wasn't the internet, people didn't know what other people in the state next door were experiencing,
right? And
they didn't have the template against which to mold or to influence, put it that way, influence their experience or their interpretation. These events were quite independent, and there was a lot of ridicule if you shared your experience. So you had to be pretty darn motivated to actually come and be open with it. Now it's almost the opposite situation, and so you have to be all the more critical in an objective way. I mean, not in a negative. I mean, I'm not one of those. I'm not becoming one of those skeptics with a capital S at all. I mean, it's just, but you have to weigh things. You really have to weigh things.
Oh, absolutely. And you're right. But to me, the best part in all this, and especially of, recently, we'll say the last 8 or 10 years, is ridicule. A lot of it has really gone by the wayside. And I think that's why a lot more of this paranormal stuff is starting to come out of the woodwork, and what people are experiencing since the coming of Sasquatch Chronicles, coast to coast and things like that. There's a lot, the stories are getting out there a lot more, and people are starting to accept the reality that there is possible that one of these creatures could be out there living and breathing. So oops. Just dropped the phone. But all right, well, we're a little over halfway through. We are going to get to some questions from the chat for Dr. Meldrum, but first, in the spirit of Spook Week, got to give us a scary story. Give us something.
Yeah. Well, I think the only one that comes to mind when you said that was one of the first experiences in the field, the first expedition I was on. And for those of you who've read my book, this will be familiar. But those of you who haven't, I elaborate upon it more fully in the introduction, because this really is what kind of set things in motion as far as field work. I was invited out with Richard Greenwell with the International Cryptozoology Society, and to spend a month in the Six Rivers National Forest on the Blue Creek drainage, which is just one ridge over from the Bluff Creek drainage. So we were, as the crow flies, 10, 20 miles from the Patterson-Gimlin film site, and working our way further north deeper into that, the headwaters of Blue Creek, and into the Siskiyou Wilderness. And anyway, on one night, our local contact and guide had gone off separate from the remainder of the group, which at that point was just, there were only 4 of us. So it was Richard and his son Darwin, and so they manned the base camp. We went further up into the wilderness area, and then went even further off trail to investigate some lakes that we were hoping the lake margins had shrunk in the summer heat and exposed some mud flats, because it was remarkable how dry and rocky and duff covered the soil was. There was very little surface that would take a track, and so it was. We were hopeful. Anyway, to make a long story short, we had upon our return to our camp there, not the base camp, but we were still far removed, he and I alone. About 2 a.m, there was this high-pitched wailing cry that just came echoing down the canyon towards us, and it woke us up. And like I said, it was in the wee hours of the morning, about 2:30 in the morning. A fog had rolled in off the California coast there, and we were literally just socked in with pea soup. It was really quite eerie, and we were camped under this giant cedar trees. We were near a spring, had a little effluent that created a bit of a bog, and then the overflow ran down beside us, nice little brooklet there, and we laid there waiting to hear anything else. And about 20-25 minutes went by, and then I could hear and feel these padded footsteps, because we're on the ground in these little bivvy tents, and the 2 of us camped separately from one another, and these heavy bipedal footfalls. And then all of a sudden I heard what at the time I thought might be 2 rocks clacking together. Pardon me. And it was responded to by a similar sound from the opposite side of our little camp. Now, in hindsight, and after having read some other accounts of witnesses who have seen Sasquatch clack their teeth as a kind of either a nervous or a bluffing kind of intimidation sort of action, just
Right.
And you can imagine those massive jaws, if it has Gigantopithecus-like teeth with that real thick enamel and broad flat cusps and crowns, that would really make a resonating clack, which this was. So I think there were 2, and then there was the clackety clack. Because of these little small bivvy tents, our backpacks were outside the tents, covered in either a poncho or a garbage bag. And Mark, my companion, his was leaning up against the tree. He had an external frame pack, then with a tarp over the top of it, and you could hear it clank. And you know how those external frames have the little pins and rings and so forth, the hardware on the frame. It was clackety clacking against the tree trunk, and we're wide awake at that point. But the problem is to extricate yourself from this little bivvy tent. You have to undo your zipper on the sleeping bag. You have to undo the interior zipper, and then there's also a rain fly. You have to do the zipper to get out. And so by the time we were both out, whatever it was had just melted back into the fog. You wouldn't have to go very far. And here's the backpack with the poncho flipped back and the clasps undone and the flaps flipped back and contents rifled through. But no sign of a bear. I mean, no claw marks, no chewing, no nothing. I mean, this didn't seem to be bear behavior. And we stood outside. I gave myself a little shiver just recalling the whole thing. But we stood outside waiting, and that dank fog, and our flashlight beams wouldn't go 5 feet into it. And we thought, well, this is silly. Nothing's going to come while we're standing here. So we slide back into our little cocoons and laid there waiting. And sure enough, I hear the pad of footfalls again down around in the direction of my feet, and then picking up pace, pad, 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 right towards me. And I could hear it coming right towards me, and it apparently dragged its hand along, because you could see the tips of what I took to be the fingertips, pressing through the rainfly, and hit there's a hoop at the head on these little things, and hit that as it went by, and the whole my little BB tent just jostled around me. And so I yelled, "Mark," wondering if that was him out there, first of all, make sure. And he answered from the opposite side. So zip, 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 we're back out again. And as we were doing that, I could hear the splashing. It ran past my tent and then rounded this sort of hedgerow of shrubs, and then angled right across the bog. And so at this point, still with flashlight beams, you could see 16-inch oval imprint in what little bit of grass there was, that where I was trying to camp on the spot that had a little bit of vegetation instead of just solid dirt. Pressed down, and the grass is just rebounding as I'm standing there, and then shine my light over around the corner, and here are these alternating great big punch marks in the bog, which then immediately filled in with water, unfortunately. So there's no evidence of detail. But that was pretty spooky. We stayed up, for a couple more hours, and then eventually just went back to sleep. It didn't come back to the camp. But the next day, as we hiked out, we had found footprints on the way in. We'd found a spot where the backside of this ridge was on the north slope, and so there was enough duff and detritus and dust on the trail, instead of rock, just being exposed rock, that there were footprints. There was also a layer of dew, and if you've ever been camping, you get up in the morning and there's your kind of dusty campground is covered with dew. You take that first barefooted step onto and the dew sticks to the bottom of your foot, and you lift up and there's a dry footprint. Well, that's what we could see. Boom, boom, boom. So they were fairly fresh. We'd found those coming in, and so I wanted to take a further look coming back, and we intended to stop right there with the footprints. And the footprints had come up the slope onto the trail and then continued up slope, aimed right at a very distinctive notch in the ridge line, where you could cross that ridge through that low point quite readily. And so, I was in a path of least resistance, and so it wasn't just purely happenstance that those tracks were on the trail. Anyway, we stopped right there, and I started to unsling my backpack, intending we were going to take a break and have a bite to eat. And all of a sudden, this softball-sized rock, literally softball-sized rock, comes from down slope, as if it were lobbed, not thrown, but arcing up, and landed literally 5 feet from me on the trail, bounced across the trail. But that made the hair stand on my neck again. And but we were determined to stay there, and we just sat there and watched and listened. Every once in a while you'd hear the brush pop or something, but nothing. And so eventually we packed up and moved on. But it apparently followed us about 5 miles back to our base camp, because that night the food cache was out in the middle of the meadow. We had all dehydrated and hermetically sealed foods, and so rather than hoist it up, Mark just double bagged it in a big contractor's bags, and it was out on this big boulder in the middle of this meadow, a good 200 yards away from camp. Well, that night something visited our camp again, and I was awoken by the sound of my backpack now being rustled. It was just laying underneath a bush in a garbage bag, a plastic bag, and it was the rustling of the bag. It woke me up, and I quickly unzipped and shone my light, but before I could get out of my tent, pad, 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 it ran by again right between our two tents, and off it went, and I couldn't catch a glimpse of it. And there was nothing right there that would take a footprint, unfortunately. But we went out to the food cache later that morning to get breakfast, and here were the bags standing up at attention, wide open. And we were down to, this was the 4th week, and we were down to the very dregs of our rations, and it had been slim pickings. Let me tell you, it was, our quartermaster was not, he was more in tune with a 3-day weekend than a 30-day expedition. I lost 15 pounds on that trip.
Wow.
And and it took its toll. I mean, it was kind of not a good kind of weight loss. It was not good. And so some of the foods were highly prized, like the flavored packets of oatmeal, because that's the only thing that had a lot of sugar in it. There was dried fruit left, and there was dried nuts and dried beef jerky. And what was ironic was here was these bags standing wide open, and a 2-gallon Ziploc bag full of instant oatmeal was gone, but the jerky and the dried fruit was left behind. Now, a bear wouldn't do that. A bear would have that would have just been demolished. Everything would have been shredded and chomped on and eaten and so forth. So that kind of selective taking of particular items seems to be a recurring theme of other people that have gifted or left things out or whatnot. But we joke because at that point, no one of us would have dared heist the oatmeal, because if we got caught, we'd get strung up and quartered, I think, and served up for dinner ourselves. But I mean, my stomach was just to show you, my stomach was so shrunk when we finally hiked all the way out to where we could make a phone call to have our ride pick us up. We were saying, because there was a little Greasy Spoon on the way, a little diner, and we said, "Oh, have him stop and get a burger." I said, "No, I want 2. No, I want 3 burgers. Have him bring me 3 burgers." I got halfway through one hamburger and I couldn't swallow another bite. My stomach was full. It was so shrunken and tightened up, I couldn't even eat half a hamburger. So it was quite an experience overall. But I mean, yeah, that was probably one of the closest encounters I've had where I'm quite confident of what we were interacting with. Yeah.
Oh, I think that would affect anybody. Absolutely. And what more evidence do you need aside from seeing what was happening? What do you attribute this activity to? I mean, you could say bear, but obviously you would think there would be a lot more of a scene.
It's very uncharacteristic of bear behavior. Then Greenwell was repeated the expedition the next year. I wasn't able to attend on that occasion, and they did have a bear get into their food cache, and it was a very old, gaunt, starved bear that had lost most of its teeth. It was so old, and it wasn't about to relinquish. And it was going through their food. They said lickety split, and this was their rations for the remainder of the trip. And they were trying to chase it off, and they got more and more belligerent and started charging at them. And they ended up dispatching it. And that's when they discovered, they could see the ribs, its teeth were missing. So very different behavior. When a black bear comes into camp, for the most part, he's in control, or it's in control, he or she is in control of the camp, and they usually are not too ready to relinquish if there's a gold mine of provisions there for them. So,
right. And bears don't usually throw softball-sized rocks uphill.
No, that's the other thing.
No,
And it came from down, and that was the other thing. It came from down slope. If it was something that had bounced down from above, I could see a rock dislodged, by rain or whatever. And just, rocks fall, just like trees fall. But this thing was clearly lobbed. And, you just had, everyone's had that sensation of being watched. and how that makes your skin crawl and so forth. That's what we experienced. I mean, it was that sensation that we were being watched, and whatever was watching us really didn't want us to stay put. I think it was because we parked ourselves right where it wanted to go. I think it was going to use that that route up through the notch, and so rather than follow us on the trail, and it wanted us to move out. You know, we were in the way.
I think what's more intriguing as well is the behavior that sets this creature apart from anything else. The thing where you said it run its fingers across the tent. I mean, what other creature is going to do anything like that? And even, like you say, selectively go through a bag,
right?
And pick. I mean, what is it that is setting this apart?
Well, I think there's the manual dexterity, which, you know, sets a primate apart from the other animals there in the woods. You know, with few exceptions, something like a raccoon, you know, they're known to be quite manually dexterous, and they get into things. But you know, you can't. Having said that, I sat in Yellowstone and watched a raven open up a backpack strapped on the sissy bar of a motorcycle, open up the clasps and get in and pull his lunch sack out and get it open and unwrap his sandwich and sit there and eat it, as we're all watching and taking pictures of it, you know, being amazed at how clever and dexterous these cormorants are.
They absolutely are.
Yeah,
ravens are among those smart ones too. We've only got a few minutes left. We may run over a few minutes if that's all right with you, Dr. Meldrum. We are gonna take some questions from the chat, so be getting your questions ready. Make sure you put those in caps so Daniela can see them. And right quick, I want to remind everyone this is your last night to get on the drawing. We're giving away a ton of prizes tomorrow night. Over $3,000 worth of stuff. The big prize, the DJI Phantom 4 drone. It's a $2,000 worth of drone that we're going to be giving away. That's the top prize. We've also got the two-way radios with earpiece. We've got the Blackwell battery bank, Bigfoot Odyssey hoodie. Dark Waters is putting in 5 year-long subscriptions. That's 5 different people are going to win that. Lost Cryptids is putting in 10 t-shirts. Matt Larson is giving away 2 Zoom classes for you researchers that need to learn how to use your camera equipment. Matt Larson is to me this is the most valuable thing, is learning to use your equipment. And he can give you, if you're not a researcher, he can show you how to use your iPhone and how to get good quality images while you're out there filming. And also got to say this, the shipping for the drone is going to be sponsored by Vermont Art Supply. You're going to be able to find a link to that in the description. Vermont Art Supply. If you guys, all you artists, go out and check them out. You'll get some good deals from them. And I want to give a shout out to my good friend Big Rick. You know, some donations go far beyond monetary value, and we appreciate you very much, Big Rick. So, all right, let's get into this. Nobody knows. That is Brandon Shoma. Go ahead, Daniela.
Did you see that?
What happened to the Falcon project? Also, do you think you saw a Sasquatch during Todd Standing's documentary? Right. I thought the rock throwing at the cabin with your group was scary.
Right. Okay, so with the Falcon project, it ran into some problems. We when I was invited to participate in that project, and oh shucks, and my old age, early senility, I just went blank on the name, but he had a couple of benefactors in his pocket, essentially, which and to whom he introduced me during the event that was held down there in St. George. And so it was basically a done deal. It was just he wanted the collaboration and the consulting and so forth. Well, then the Great Recession hit at that point. And one of these philanthropists, his money was going to come through the sale of a piece of property down in California. That bottomed out. And the other, his liquidity was in the stock market, and that bottomed out. And so suddenly they both demurred from participating. And so then I was not on board to be a rainmaker to fundraiser, and but we did try. I did try to help him with one project where we tried to do something in Portland, a live streaming subscription-based production, and unfortunately, the gentleman that had agreed, a professional, a radio professional, that had agreed to set up all the technology there in Portland for this event, got his feelings hurt or something happened, and he pulled out literally the night of or night before. So we had an event that was attended by very few people because most of the people were planning to attend online and subscribe, and so could barely pay for the rental of the arena, the venue. And so it just kind of, that lasted for about 8 years and went bouncing along there. We had a couple of professional fundraisers who, GoFundMe type, who would set up these campaigns, and they said, "Oh, this is a no-brainer. We'll get this for you in 2 weeks." Well, they set it all up, they did it, and after 2 months, there were like 6 donors, 6 contributors, and a total of a couple $100. So there was also a kind of a grassroots rejection by the Sasquatch community. I kind of thought people would just jump on board and everyone would write their check for $25 $50, and it would just materialize, and there was just a grassroots rejection rather than a grassroots support. And I think it was sticker shock. I mean, because it was a very ambitious project. I mean, he was shooting for the moon, and yeah. So anyway, it floundered, never recovered from that. And it was interesting. It was a learning curve for me too, as I became more and more educated about that kind of drone. I then subsequently was involved with another gentleman who had rather deep pockets, and we discussed this option. We decided to approach it from a much more conservative point or approach rather, conservatively, and had a lighter than air ship that had a much smaller one instead of extremely expensive, and I can't even remember what the dollar figure was. It was a fraction of that. But we were working with a team down in Park City, based out of Park City, and we got together too with one of the camera specialists. We had just tremendous challenges trying to get these two engineers, the camera engineer and the aeronautical engineer, together on how to combine this system. We should have just gone off the shelf, quite honestly, in hindsight now. But flying this thing was a challenge. I mean, if you had more than 25-mile-an-hour winds, maneuvering this thing was really quite problematic. And flying it was not that easy either. I mean, I don't have the thumbs. We would have definitely hired a young, very experienced gamer, because the console, I mean, every time that they would hand me this console and try to fly it, because as soon as you turn around, then your directions are different. You're opposite of what you think it's supposed to be, and up is not down, it's down is up, and every time they'd hand me that console, I would have that feeling I would get when I, as a youngster, I'd go up and brave a jump off the high dive. That feeling in the pit of your stomach. I said, I can't do this. I said, we need some young whippersnapper to fly this thing. But anyway, when we ran into the remarkable challenges trying to equip it with the camera equipment, eventually my colleague just threw up his hands and he said, "This is ridiculous. We're not." And so he sold the airship. We went back to the old guard game. So let's see, Todd Standing. I had a very interesting experience up there with Todd. I mean, the location was just phenomenal. I mean, to see the Jasper Mountains on the horizon to the south, and we were in this kind of really interesting depression with braided streams going through it. There was a major river that meandered through that had extensive sandbars with wildlife tracks galore. I mean, I just couldn't understand why Todd wasn't spending. I kept saying, you need to check this place out, this sandbar out, or these sandbars. I mean, this whole stretch. You need to be checking this out every day that you're out here. And they have survey grids where they would clear cut a swath on a grid pattern of about 5 miles apart, and you could sit on the top of a ridge. I posted on my Facebook page one point of view where you could look down for miles down this stretch from a high point and see anything that walked across that gap. So we'd be sitting there watching with binoculars, and you'd see a deer walk across over here. Down there'd be a fox run across. I just thought, boy, sitting up here with a thermal camera and night vision would be the way to go. But I caught a glimpse. We had something approach camp at about 2 a.m. We would routinely stay up quite late and around the campfire, because I mean, that far north, that late in the season, the sun didn't come up till like 10 o'clock in the morning. And so we would stay up late and sleep in late. And something approached camp. There was a vocalization. There was brush popping as it circled outside the firelight, and it would react to our talking to it or trying to coax it to come out, and it would break brush or break branches. I mean, and at one point it broke something. It sounded like it, Matt Moneymaker hitting the tree with his Louisville Slugger, this crack, and that's when it broke from the shadows of the tree line on one side of the road and crossed over the very light granitic gravel of the roadbed. And there was just enough ambient light. I had a night vision binocular. I didn't have an IR illuminator on it. And so the ambient light was a little bit low. Things are a little bit noisy, speckly on the screen. But I saw what I would describe as, if you imagine Patty in complete silhouette, and obscured, like when she's going behind the logs, there was a berm that we were in front of. That's what I saw. And they found Bindernagel and Standing found tracks, not clear footprints, but they found a trackway where you clearly could see impressions and broken vegetation right where, when they taped it out, and John walked that line while Todd filmed from the same vantage I had back when I was looking with the night vision. I mean, John was in the right place, going the right direction, except he was 1.5 feet shorter than what I saw. So,
wow.
And what was the third one on there? There were 3 questions, I think.
He just said he thought the rock throwing at the cabin was scary.
Oh yeah, up at Snowgrove Lake. That was interesting. I'd had enough rocks thrown at me that I took it right in stride. I mean, it was that was what we were hoping for, but it was hilarious because what you didn't see on camera was all the rest of the team bolt for the cabin and inside. And it was quite funny because the culvert that the fire pit was in was kind of tall, and so it cast a long shadow. And there was a little stack of chopped firewood, split firewood. And as I took a step to the side, I stepped on one of those little triangular pieces of cordwood, and it rolled my ankle, and I went right down to the ground. Well, from inside the cabin, it looked like I had been beamed by a second rock. And they thought for sure Sasquatch had got me. So they, to their credit, they did come to my rescue. They came out to make sure I was okay. But anyway, that was an interesting experience, very much so.
Let's do one more and then we'll wrap this thing up. I see one here, South Alabama Sasquatch. This is a good one here. Dr. Meldrum, the majority of footprints that I find show 3 to 4 digits, adult and juvenile, as well as a hook J at the heel. Love to hear your opinion on why that is. You ever see that little hook on the heel?
I've not. I'd like to see if he would send me some pictures of that. My experience with 3 and 4 toes is I've yet to see a supposed 3 or 4 toe that was actually a footprint. with a couple of exceptions. And that is sometimes, for example, a bear, their inner toe is the short toe on the hind foot, more like a little short thumb, and it takes they tend to walk on the outsides of their feet, and so the inner toe sometimes leaves a very faint imprint and will give the impression of 4 toes. Or if you have the first edition of John Green's book, for example, on the print on the cover, and it's reproduced elsewhere, but the 5th toe doesn't leave an imprint on that particular footprint. There are others in the trackway where it clearly has 5 toes. Likewise, the tracks in '96 that I saw in southeastern Washington with Paul Freeman, there were some of the prints where when the toes were simply extended, and it was on the flat, so it wasn't really curling its toes in to gain purchase. The 4th and 5th left very faint impressions, and in some of those you couldn't even see the 5th. But then, the next step, it's digging its toes in as it slides in the mud, and all 5 toes are clearly there. So that can happen. The other possibility would be, frostbite or amputation from a injury or something like that, a deformity. The Bosberg track has 1 toe that is pushed up between the other toes, and so from the bottom it looks like there's only 4 toes. So a deformity. But notions of inbreeding and things like that, I don't see any evidence. I haven't seen any convincing evidence that that's the case. But like I said, there's always a first time, and please send me some good pictures of if they're good, clear casts that are unambiguous. I'm willing to be proven wrong.
Well, the hook he's talking about and I've seen it.
Yeah.
In my assertion, for what that's worth, was the pace at which they were walking. Just maybe that the foot comes down the hill first, and it's hitting and turning just a little bit as they're walking. But I've seen it with several different sizes, a lot in the South, Florida, Louisiana. Really seen it a lot in Florida. So it was I just couldn't figure out this really emaciated looking, small, thin footprint, that's 12 inches long, but really thin heel. But it had that they didn't all have it. So that's why the assertion that it's either the substrate or the pace that they're moving at. I don't know, something going on there for sure.
Sometimes, humans, especially because we walk with a decided heel strike and we barely clear our foot, that sometimes we drag the heel just a little bit, or if we're walking in snow, and we'll leave what's called a comet tail. They refer to it. It's just a little preemptive drag in before the heel makes full weight contact.
Right.
And and depending on how the foot is carried, you could conceivably make a little J hook, I guess, in that with the comet tail. But you've got my curiosity peaked now, and I'd like to see some pictures of it. So
I'll send you some.
Please share them. Yeah,
I've got quite a few. I'll make sure you get those. But hey, look, Dr. Meldrum, we certainly appreciate you being here with us. It's been fantastic. You're obviously we'd love to have you back for a researcher's report.
Sure.
When the new book comes out, for sure. I know you're working on a new project.
That's probably a couple years down the road, but definitely we'll follow up. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. We appreciate you. And just real quick, tomorrow night, Halloween night, Wes Germer, Tony Merkel are going to be here with us. We're going to have a great show for you guys. A lot of really cool, spooky stories Wes is putting together. We're going to be doing the drawing. And next month, November 13th, 14th, myself, Linda, and Brad are all heading to Oklahoma. We're filming our 13th installment of Bigfoot Odyssey, the documentary series with Livewire, Mark Copeland. So, and that was the whole reason for the giveaway. So we're heading there. And then after that, at some point soon, we're heading down to Florida to do Crypto Reality and Donnie Miller. We're going to tell their story. So we appreciate everybody that put on that. Cutting it off at 6 a.m. Central in the morning is the last chance to get in for the drawing. So thanks everyone for showing up here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Meldrum, and Danielle. As always, you do fantastic. Can't thank you enough for the work you do here. And good night, everybody.